Hi, I'm Micah Halpern. Thank you for joining me today as I do some thinking out loud. Our first segment is called Background Briefing. The first thing I've been thinking about is the ripples across the international community in the wake of the U.A.E. Israel peace accord that are beginning to be felt all over the place. And this is valuable to get a sense of what's going on. There has been virtually no condemnation in the Arab world about this agreement, except, and not all surprisingly, from the regular suspects. That's a quote from, of course, Casablanca. They are the Palestinians, Iran, Turkey, and Qatar. Several countries in the Arab world are denying that they are in talks with the Jewish state, Israel, but they are. And that, too, is to be expected. The reality is that the Arab world is no longer what it once was. The Palestinian issue, once front and center, is now practically irrelevant. The change has been evolving over the past few years. Once upon a time, when the Palestinian leadership requested solidarity among Arab nations against the Jewish state, there was almost complete compliance, a word I like to use because of the COVID issue today. Now, when the Palestinians and Palestinian leadership shouts and beckons and implores fellow Arabs to participate in mass demonstrations across the Arab world and Muslim world and to offer them support, the response they receive is at best muted, or often silent, with one exception, and that exception, of course, is Iran. The Arab world has determined that Palestinian leadership is locked into the past, and they do not see and are not willing to accept the new reality that has emerged, that Israel is here to stay, and that Israel is a force to be dealt with. Palestinian leadership remains steadfast. Abbas and his cronies cannot be coaxed or tempted or convinced or even plied that it is better to accept the new reality, which means peace and coexistence, than to be locked in the unrealistic hope that Israel will be destroyed by the combined efforts of pan-Arab society. They still hold onto the hope, first fostered by Yasser Arafat, that they can push Israel into the sea. They cannot let go of the dream of conquering Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Jaffa, and many other cities within Israel today. And as a result, they would also like to have all of Jerusalem. The prevalent stance of the greater Arab leadership and Muslim leadership in the Middle East and beyond is that there is more to gain from Israel than there is to gain by ignoring or totally rejecting her. Over the past few decades, the Arab world has been divided into two groups. The first group is the extremist. The second is the silent majority. Extremism in the Arab world, just like everywhere else in the world, is loud and aggressive. By definition, extremists are the loudest voice in the room, or on the street, or in the conversation. But slowly, incrementally, in the Arab world, the silent majority has begun to raise their collective voice, and they are beginning to give their voice to their disdain for extremism and their abhorrence of revolution. The masses have become angry, really angry. Their anger stems from the realization, slow in coming, but now impossible to ignore, that the revolution did not work. Arabs, especially Palestinians, look around, right, left, and see failure all around them. They were promised better times and a better society, and instead, their lives got worse. Yasser Arafat's dream was to fight for and liberate the Palestinians. Mahmoud Abbas, Arafat's successor, buys into that same vision. It is a vision that requires violence, revolution, to bring to fruition their goal. Their model is not to talk to their enemy, not to sit down and negotiate with Israel, not to negotiate on settlements, not to negotiate agreements. They want to force Israel to give them a state. They're old school. They want to achieve their goal through terror and violence only. They don't realize, cannot accept, that those days are over, that nowadays the world works differently. Worse is that the Palestinians still is that their plan has backfired. The model of achieving a state through violence and terror is a broken model. The dream of a Palestinian state is further away today than it has ever been because of this silly leadership issue. Fighting Palestinian terror has made Israel stronger, not weaker. And in the greater Arab world, it's important to realize that patience for years has turned into decades. Arab leadership has determined that the Palestinian cause has failed. They know that it is time to move on and set new goals to change the tried and failed modus operandi. They know that they have accepted the Palestinian leadership, and now they deny what the Palestinian leadership has presented. Now, this is important. It took a lot of growth and soul-searching to reach this conclusion, but kudos to today's Arab and Muslim leadership around the world. The next thing you should know is that this is transformative. And so I've been thinking about a lot of issues with regard to the Middle East. The next thing I've been thinking about is Turkey and Hamas. Media coverage of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, his name is pronounced Erdogan, spelled Erdogan, but pronounced Erdogan, has been sparse because he hosted a meeting with Hamas leadership. It's understandable that such a meet would be labeled as insider baseball and hence not important, but neither Hamas nor Turkey have had much of an impact on Western politics recently. But neither of them have perpetrated deeds large enough to catch the attention of these past few months to actually warrant them being in the headlines and on the front pages. But not covering what was truly a seminal event demonstrates just how little mainstream media understands the Middle East. This meeting was huge. The meeting of Turkey and its president and the leaders of Hamas. The most significant result of this meeting between the two haters of the West, actually the dictionary definition of haters of all Western world embodies and holds dear, is that according to the Jerusalem Post, these Hamas leaders actually, and other Hamas terrorist leaders, not just present at the meeting, they were issued passports from Turkey, Turkish passports. Let that sink in for a second. Hamas leaders and others were issued Turkish passports. Those documents, official and legal documents issued by the Turkish government, will allow these terror leaders to travel freely throughout the world, especially Europe, raising money to murder innocents and even murdering Israelis and Americans that might be in Israel. The United States government understands fully the impact of this meeting, though the media did not. The United States is not pleased at all. And when the United States State Department issued a statement of public criticism of Turkey, Turkey immediately rejected the comments. And that's par for the course. The United States and many Western allies consider Hamas to be a terrorist organization. And according to the United States, their State Department especially, they say that they're a terrorist organization. And here's the statement about the meeting. They said, quote, Hamas officials were specially designated global terrorists, unquote. And the United States was seeking information about one member of the delegation for his involvement in multiple terrorist attacks, hijackings, and kidnappings. Washington is of the opinion that Erdogan's meeting with Hamas leaders will hurt not only the West, but also hurt Palestinians. The United States believes that supporting Hamas over the Palestinian Authority is a mistake. So why did Turkish President Erdogan host the full delegation of Hamas? Because Turkey and Hamas are now diabolical and kindred spirits. Turkey, which has for a long time supported Hamas both financially and politically, has become a sponsor of terror. Certainly giving them passports makes them a sponsor of terror. And not just a small, on the sidelines sponsor or wannabe sponsor of terror. The Erdogan government has maneuvered itself into the position parallel to Iran in joining forces with those who oppose the West, especially the United States and Israel. That's unnerving, but not surprising to those with a deep understanding of the Middle East. Now, present at the meeting with Erdogan were, and this is important to get the list, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh, as well as Hamas military wing founder and leader Salah al-Aruri. Hamas member singled out, by the way, by the U.S. government and State Department in their statement. Also present were the head of Hamas foreign branch, Maher Salah, and the group's representative in Turkey, Jihad Yagmur. Now, the group went to Turkey to report on the Palestinian situation. There were two topics to be discussed, of course. That's obvious to everyone. They were the annexation of the West Bank and the Abraham Accord, which is the peace accord between the United Arab Emirates and Israel. Interestingly, the Palestinians are still burning, and that's important. It's obvious to everyone, but they're still burning about Israel's annexation plan, despite the fact that it's shelved by the U.A.E. Accord. In fact, Turkey, Iran, Hamas, and the Palestinian Authority are among the only voices to have come out in condemnation of the accord. Hamas needs Turkish monetary support and aid. They need Turkey to do what Iran cannot do for them anymore because of the crisis that they're dealing with. They need donors. Bottom line, Hamas needs Turkey to open doors for them. Over the past few years, Turkey has been forging its place as a bulwark against the West. First, Turkey created excellent relations with Iran. Now, given that Iran has been sidelined because of economic sanctions and, of course, because of the issue of COVID, Turkey has stepped right up to the plate and is usurping some of Iran's traditional roles, often with the blessing of Iranian leadership. Vanquishing the West is so important to Iranian leadership, they are even willing to share the spotlight on this issue. Turkey is filling the void not only for Hamas, but also in Syria. There are two criteria for the success of Turkey in terms of understanding their model, their vision, their shared worldview between Turkey and Iran. First is successful support of Muslims. Second is hurting the United States and Israel. Turkey and Israel have a rocky relationship, no question about it. Their commercial and economic ties are very good, but their diplomatic ties are not. While their military ties were once exceptional, today they are non-existent. They don't exist. Tensions came to a head in the summer of 2016. All of you remember this, when the Turkish flotilla attempted to break Israel's sea blockade of Gaza. Israeli commandos boarded the ship. The name of the ship was Mavi Marmara. 9 people on board were killed and 10 commandos were injured. And then, while they still maintained diplomatic ties, in 2018, Turkey and Israel expelled each other's ambassadors. Tensions have been at a rolling boil for years as Turkish President Erdogan moves further and further into his role as Islamist leader. Among his proudest achievements is ousting the secular pro-Western military caste in Turkey. And that caste actually secured and stabilized Turkey from the extremist tendencies of Islamic leadership, like that of Erdogan. Turkey is on the wrong side of international behavior. This meeting with Hamas makes that point even louder and more clear. It behooves us to pay attention to that roar. Coming up next, points of view. First up is from the RNS, which is the Religion News Service. It's penned by Michelle Chabin. Michelle has been a friend since she moved to Israel nearly 3 decades ago. She's an excellent writer with keen insight. This piece is entitled, Orthodox Jewish Students Embrace Gap Year in Israel Despite COVID-19. To set the stage, Israel has been in lockdown since March because of COVID. Only Israelis may enter. Yet 17,000 students, 12,000 yeshiva students, 1-year students actually, gap year students, entered to start their year in Israel. Of course, they had to be vetted and to isolate for 14 days, but then they were able to be admitted. A disclaimer, I need you to understand this. I've taught in these institutions for years. These are not just yeshiva students. They're gap year kids, as well as university students. Large groups from Young Judea, let's say, for instance, are coming. Over 200 from Young Judea alone. A disclaimer about my teaching there. I actually even spent a year in the gap year program in 1979. I spent the year on Machon L'Madrachei Chutz La'aretz, representing Young Judea. It's a long time ago, but it was enormously important. These programs transform youth. These programs are the greatest vehicle to foster lovers of Israel in the entire bag of tools of Jewish education. They inspire a love of Judaism and the love of Israel. This is how Shaban begins. Throughout high school, Adina Levin, 17, dreamed about spending a gap year in Israel, studying at an Orthodox Jewish seminary. Then COVID-19 hit. I was worried the seminary would cancel for the coming year, but it hasn't, said Levin, a recent high school graduate and resident of Walnut Creek, California. Despite its continuing entry ban on all but a few non-citizens in July, the Israeli government decided to allow some 17,000 foreign students, including 12,000 mostly American Orthodox yeshiva and seminary students, on their gap year to enter the country under strict COVID protocols. Now, Shaban lays out the argument on both sides. She writes, and quoting, allowing students like Levin into the country has been controversial. Israel is struggling to contain the coronavirus and is denying many requests for family reunification. Some lawmakers accuse the government of caving in to pressure from ultra-Orthodox political parties, which threatened to bring down the government if the students weren't allowed into the country. Why are yeshiva students and other students allowed over relatives of Israeli citizens? Parliamentarian Meirav Michaeli, a member of the opposition Labour Party, tweeted. Aryeh Deri from the Orthodox Shas Party defended the move. A mother does not tell her children that she doesn't have the strength to host them, Deri told Channel 12, an Israeli news channel. Shaban now concludes and explains that kids who come to Israel are smitten with a love of Israel. They come back for more, even during the pandemic. Avi Weinrib, a yeshiva student who flew back to Los Angeles just before Israel sealed its borders in March due to COVID-19, will be spending the coming year his third in Israel. He plans to return this fall to serve as a counselor to first-year students at the Aish HaTorah Yeshiva in Jerusalem. Weinrib hopes the time he spent in Israel this year will make up for what he missed out during the pandemic. And here he's quoted by saying, I feel like last year was cut short. I feel like I still need to experience some growth and guidance in my life. I know I'll get this in yeshiva. I love being in Israel and probably see myself having a future there. Next up is an analysis by AP. It's unauthored, and one of the interesting things is I plucked it from Ynet, but it can be found all over the place. It's appeared all over. It just happens to be that I'm on Ynet all the time, so it's easy for me to get. It's entitled, Powerhouse Hezbollah Facing Growing Anger in Lebanon. Subtitle is, following the devastating blast in Beirut port, the Iranian-backed group now has to contend with dwindling power, myriad of accusations, and significant backlash from those seeking to finally end the organization's grip on the country. There is always a problem with untitled analysis. It means that there is no way of predetermining a bias or directing a critique. In this case, the piece is well-balanced and well-reasoned. The piece begins. Sarah Jafar joined a group of political activists gathered on August 4th to discuss strategies to challenge Lebanon's entrenched rulers when their building was shaken and the windows blasted out by a giant explosion that rocked Beirut. She took cover from the flying debris, thoughts rushing through her head of past political assassinations in Lebanon. Her immediate reaction was that Hezbollah, the militant group that dominates power here, was targeting the dissidents' meeting. It continues. In the wake of the blast, Hezbollah has come under unprecedented public criticism and its role in Lebanese politics under intense scrutiny. Cardboard effigies of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and other politicians were hanged on nooses at rallies after the blast. Some accused Hezbollah of storing weapons at the port, a claim it denies. Hezbollah political rivals seized the opportunity to fan hostilities against it and its allies. Concluding, the author explains that there is serious critique of Hezbollah. She, like many in Lebanon, see her country's political crisis as a product of rivalry between Hezbollah's patron, Iran, and the U.S. and Gulf states. Only a resolution to that conflict will force change, she said. I understand why they exist. They filled the gap where the state failed, said Jafar. We want a real nation, a real country, she said. This is a jungle. Jafar said protest activists are realizing they must work with allies within the system to change, push for early elections and challenge Hezbollah and its allies in parliament. We won't get rid of them in one election, she said. She's correct. Coming up, commentary through cartoons where pictures tell the story. I want to show you 3 items today. 1 is a sign, and 2 are newspaper items. The first is a play on the world of hand sanitizers. It's a sign posted in a coffee bar saying, these are cafe syrups, not hand sanitizers. It's so funny because anytime you see a pump bottle, you automatically go and use it. At least I automatically go and use it. It's called, I go and purell my hands. It's the word I use. They make it into a verb, purelling my hands. Next up is a funny news item about the pandemic and what the pandemic can do and causes one to go off the deep end and overreact. Here's the example. It's called Uneasy Feeling. Ron Newman of Chatham, Kentucky, was sentenced to 140 hours of community service by the Croydon Crown Court after admitting hitting his friend over the head with a guitar because he kept playing the wrong chord in the Eagles' peaceful, easy feeling. That's funny. Talk about irony. Finally, some thieves are plain and simple clueless. This headline proves the point very clearly. 3 Florida men allegedly committed a series of burglaries while wearing ankle monitors. That's funny, as if they can't be placed now at the scene of the crime. In a moment, more of my own perspective and a few predictions. A leading member of Hamas posted a video that called on Palestinians to murder all 7 million Jews that live in the diaspora. Everywhere they live, all 7 million.
يجب أن نهجم على كل يهودي متواجد في الكرة الأرضية ذبحا وقتلا بإذن الله سبحانه وتعالى.
Fatih Hamad said, 7 million Palestinians outside of Palestine. Enough warming up. You have Jews with you in every place. You should attack every Jew possible in all the world. Kill them. Established Palestinian leadership in the Palestinian Authority condemned his comments. Even the Hamas distanced itself from Hamad's comments, saying that their fight was with the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories and not a conflict with Jews across the world or Judaism as a religion. But the denial of other Palestinian leaders cannot put the genie back in the bottle. This call to murder touched a real chord. Remember when I told you that Iran was smuggling oil to Venezuela? Remember that it was a blatant violation of U.S. sanctions against Iran? Venezuela needed the oil. Even though they're sitting on a huge set of oil reserves themselves, Venezuela is suffering from a terrible oil shortage. Their industry has been falling apart and is in bad need of replacement parts for the pumping mechanisms. Venezuela is also suffering from U.S. sanctions against Iran. Now, that's because the U.S. sanctions didn't apply not only to oil, it also did not permit any oil industry replacement parts either. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro thanked Iran for sending oil and oil factory parts to them. In his official statement of thanks to Iran, Maduro suggested that Venezuela will also be purchasing missiles from Iran. The nexus of Iran and Venezuela does not portend well for the rest of the world. The new COVID numbers are in from Israel, and they're not good. The most compelling numbers are truly disturbing. Israel is using the traffic light system to establish procedures in dealing with COVID. The point is that the entire country is not monolithic. Each area is different, and different policies are required for each place. Of the thousands of cities and villages in Israel, all except for 20 are green or yellow. Only 20 are red zones, and those cities are divided into regions, which are also again divided into color zones. Here is the most troubling dimension of the new COVID-19 numbers. 40% of the positive numbers are from the Haredi community. 20% of the new positives are from the Arab communities. The 40% is probably much higher because rabbis in the Haredi community have urged their members not to get tested because those results can cause hatred against their community. Leaders need to be urged to put a stop to large gatherings. People must be urged by their leaders to wear masks. COVID-19 numbers will increase if these steps are not taken soon. The economy of Israel is dependent on getting those numbers down. Tourism cannot return to Israel until Israel becomes a green state. Only then Israel will open its borders and the green countries around the world will be allowed to tour and bring their dollars. One recent evening, 26 fire balloons from Gaza flew into Israel. Most of the fires they created were small and were extinguished by the firefighters. On another night, 60 balloons and kites were launched towards Israel. Incendiary balloons and kites are becoming more and more common. They are launched into Israel from Gaza night after night. Israel has struck back, hitting the sites that launched designed the bombs. Israel has attacked the headquarters of the groups who perpetrate these attacks. These attacks are very low tech. And one of the interesting things is they cost only pennies to make. They're made of balloons, of party balloons, and condoms, and plastic bags. They do not require sophisticated expertise. Israel has high-tech weapons, and now they need to go low-tech to shoot down these kites. We've been thinking out loud about a lot today. Now that you know what I've been thinking, let me know what you're thinking. Email me at micah@jbstv.org. Tweet me at Micah Halpern. Tell me what you think. Before we end, let me leave you with one piquant piece of information. Did you know that the term, the Middle East, is a very new term? Before World War II, the expression used in general across the board to refer to the area was the Near East. The term Middle East probably originated in the 1850s in the British India office. However, it became widely known when American naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan used the term in the 1902 to designate the area between Arabia and India. During this time, the British and Russian empires were vying for influence in Central Asia, a rivalry which would become known as the Great Game. Mahan realized not only the strategy and importance of the region, but also of its center, the Persian Gulf. He labeled the area surrounding the Persian Gulf as the Middle East and said that after Egypt's Suez Canal, it was the most important passage for Britain to control in order to keep the Russians from advancing towards British India. Thank you for thinking out loud with me, Micah Halpern. Let's think out loud again next week on JBS.